All right. Welcome everybody back to OKC WebDevs, our third official meetup, second during all the COVID fun. So just to reintroduce everybody, I'm Aaron Kraus, one of the user group leaders of this group. Previously was in charge of OKC Ruby with John Mosesman, who is also a user group leader here, although not here today. And also we got Stephen Vincent on this call and our speaker today. So, we hope you're in for the time of your life. This next hour is going to be pretty bomb. It's going to be the highlight of your week. I hope you've got all your food, got all your snacks, got your dogs ready. And beyond that, we are Techlahoma. We are sponsored by Techlahoma. Usually that means we get food for you all when you come to the meetups. We'll do that again someday, but not for a while. Usually we're also sponsored by Starspace because they usually host us, but at this point we're not because we're obviously all virtual. So beyond that, if you want to learn more about Techlahoma, I would say just Google it. We are a nonprofit group that there's a Techlahoma board. Nobody is paid to be on the board. It's all volunteer driven. You've probably heard of Techlahoma, but if you haven't, feel free to Google it, and that'll give you all the information you need. You can donate to Techlahoma, a monthly donation starting at like $8, 8, 16, 32. You see the trend. You can do annual donations. You can donate whatever if you want to, or you can donate your time and become a speaker for us or any other group because we are always looking for speakers. And if you do want to speak at OKC WebDevs, just hit me up in Slack. I'm the code boss. You can hit up Stephen Vincent. He's at Vincent. John Mosesman as John Mosesman. Yeah, that's the best way to speak with us. Beyond that, there is a code of conduct for Techlahoma. There's a handful of stuff in there. All I'm gonna say is if you feel like you're being bullied or if anyone is in violation of the code of conduct and you feel threatened or anything like that, just hit myself up, hit Vince, Stephen up, John Mosesman, anybody in the Techlahoma either group leadership or board leadership, and we can help get that figured out. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today and user group leader, Stephen Vincent, going to talk about microservices using NestJs. So, let's give a virtual round of applause for Stephen here.
Hey everyone, go ahead and share my screen. I'm gonna have to switch between a few, our slide presentation, our code example, and then we'll have an actual demo hitting our endpoints. So let me go ahead and start that. All right, so yeah, this is a microservice built with NestJs framework with collaboration of GraphQL. The implementation that I have is a scalable user service. It's something that I put together for a client, got his permission to share. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. As Aaron said, my name is Stephen Vincent. I'm a front-end developer. I work on a whole slew of different technologies. I have a lot of experience on pretty much every layer of the tech stack, and I like to just talk tech. This is just one of those projects that I've worked on that I fell in love with, and yeah, I just want to just dive right into it. Before we do that, I work for a company called Jinn Studios. We are a software consulting company. We build anything and everything. So we've worked with Fortune 500 companies. We've also worked for mom and pop shops. If you have software that needs to be created, we can do that for you. Or if you are a talented developer, we would love to hear from you, both to collab, to contract with, and just talk with. We do a monthly drawing for a free pizza party for an organization. So you can go to jinnstudios.com/pizza, fill out the form, and if you're lucky, we'll buy pizza for your organization. There are some restrictions, but yeah, as long as you don't have 100 people in your organization, if you want us to just buy a single pizza for you, put down your information and maybe you can get that free pizza. A little bit about the project. There is a lot of technologies going here. I'm going to highlight a few of them. So what I want to do is just see what's under the hood right now, and then we'll dive into each one. And then at the very end, we can kind of ask some questions based off of people's interest. But it is NestJs. It's a powerful framework that's built on top of Node, and it both supports TypeScript and JavaScript. And that's really important in this talk because As you'll see here, its versatility is really why I liked this application for the client that I was developing for. We're also going to be using the non-standard REST API. We're going to be using a query language called GraphQL. Aaron actually did a full-length talk on a Ruby implementation. I definitely recommend checking that out. We're not going to dive into everything related to GraphQL, but more of how Nest utilizes GraphQL in this particular instance. I'm also going to be talking about JSON Web Tokens as the standard for using auth guards. And then out of the box, the testing framework that Nest comes with is both Jest and Supertest. But being a Node.js framework, you can really use anything that you can think of that is already built in with Node. These are just the two popular ones. Both Jest for just being a really good, robust, and easy to use framework, and then Supertest being just the most performant. Now, if they're the best, I'm not really sure. I just wanted to mention those because they are out of the box, zero setup needed for Nest. Also want to provide a few useful links before we get started. Of course, the first one is the GitHub project. I have this entire code ready to clone for you guys to use. I keep it up to date. The README file has a gratuitous amount of information, links, and things like that. So definitely check that out. You can find that at my company's organization, GitHub, github.com/Jinn Studios. If you want to know more about the comparisons about GraphQL and REST, I found a great article that I love. It's written by the Apollo team. If you're not familiar with their technology or their library, another great library to check out. But they definitely go in the pros and the cons for both technologies, things that either one is good for. Check out our previous lightning talk for our JWT breakdown. I'm not going to go into that in this talk, but I definitely utilize that technology because it is a very awesome technology to use. And finally, if you're really wanting to dive real deep into microservices, my company has articles upon articles on our website. Definitely check them out. They're all written for .NET. That's kind of our bread and butter, and I feel like if you're in Oklahoma, that's kind of a standard. And this architecture is loosely based off of the articles that we have there. So there are a lot of similarities that you'll see that I developed in this project that we dive in a much deeper conversation within those articles. So a lot of you are probably here because you're like, what's Nest? Why should I use it? I want to first preface that I am never loyal to any framework. You will never hear me say that this is better than this, because every technology should be working for me as a developer. So really what I want to do is provide you with a few just bullet points and features, so that way if for some reason you are finding yourself into a situation where business or your team lead or just a one-off project is asking you, how should we develop this, the server-side application. If you didn't know this technology existed, you may not even know that it would be an option for you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in some of those key points that I found myself really liking this framework. Again, I mentioned before that it's built with Express and Node as its core, and it really integrates well with a wide variety of technologies. And you'll see those technologies here today with them. And with every new version that comes out, they actually are adding more and more built-in integration, so that way you're not having to pull in a third-party library and making it work for your application. One of those technologies we use in this application, which was TypeORM. And before, earlier this year, I was actually using the third-party, their actual library. And then it ended up becoming so popular that they built a built-in Nest integration. So I simply just had to reference it from the core Nest framework and plug and play. It was good to go. So there was less fighting. It was more built-in, and I loved it. And they really do add a lot. And the documentation for each one of those that they add is just perfect. So context switching, I think everyone uses that buzzword, but I can tell you for my client, that was the whole reason why we decided to go with this technology. They were already a TypeScript shop. They used a lot of different TypeScript technologies. I think they had some for Angular, React, and in Vue. And because they were using TypeScript, this, again, Nest uses both TypeScript or native JavaScript. So it allowed them to actually go from one front-end client-side code to a server-side code a lot easier. Another context switching fix that it was is if your shop, like this one was a smaller shop where think it was 10 or less developers, and every developer was expected to be a full stack developer. And I'm not saying that as a title. I meant that in the fact that they would get full features. And if this sounds like something your shop does, it might be perfect for you. But they get full features, and they were expected to do it the entire development through every layer. So from the client UI all the way down to the database object. And this really helped cut down that context switching, which leads me to my next thing, which is these are tightly intertwined, but the architecture is based off of, in Nest, off of the Angular file structure. That's not to say that it is exactly like Angular. It's just that the Nest developer that created it realized the scalability inside the Angular architecture and really pulls a lot of motivation from Angular. That being said, it combines elements of OP, FP, and FRP. If you're unfamiliar with those acronyms, I'm not going to dive into them. You should know about them. They're really great concepts. Just go ahead and look those up, and you'll be glad that you did. The last one is the CLI. The Nest CLI is very robust, and I absolutely love it. I was one of those people that came from an over-dependence on IDEs. And so when using a command line tool at the very beginning, I was like, why would I type in commands when I can easily right-click and stuff? Well, that's because their CLI, for me, was I typed in one command and it just scaffolded an insane amount of technology, and I loved it. And you can even use it nowadays, and for generating just basic components or files, and it's just their support for their CLI is better than most when they come out. So definitely a pro for me. One more thing that I want to kind of elaborate on is that Nest actually does support both code first or schema first for your project. In this project, we decided to go with the code first. Again, my motivation was to reduce the context switching, and the best way to do that for this client was to use code first. But you can do the schema first. So if your shop is a very like domain driven, heavy on keeping your microservices as contracts as tight as possible, and you want to build your domain objects from the ground up, definitely do the schema first. But in this project, we use the code first, and you're going to see a lot of uses of decorators in this project. And that is one of the things I loved about it, because with the TypeScript classes, that really reduces the complexity and keeps the code much cleaner. Now, you do have to kind of have some fundamental knowledge, which we will go over. But once you have the fundamental knowledge, it really translates across a multitude of different types of classes within the framework. As an example, the domain object that's on the left generates the schema object that's on the right. So a little explanation is that you'll see all the decorators over here with followed by the @ symbol. My original programming language of choice when I first started developing years ago was in Java. And so a lot of annotation, people who are used to annotations in Java, they're going to find this as an easy port over. And a lot of ORMs also follow the same sort of style. So you should be very familiar with it. And if not, it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, you'll see that in every single one of these variables, there are two decorators stacked on top of each other. Every one that's on here that's on the top comes from Nest for their code first. And then the ones that are on the bottom are for type ORM, which is the ORM that I use to interact with the MS SQL database that's being used in this project. So we denote this user object, or excuse me, this domain object as using an object type. And then you'll see on there that we have the field object seen on each one of these. Now, the domain object field is very interesting because you can use it, as you see on email right here, with nothing in there, right? And then it will drive, if it can, the type from whatever type you define on that property. The next thing you can do is you can actually define the specific type. For instance, this is an ID. Well, an ID is a number in our respect, but we wanted to denote it as a type of ID. Now, that's really important, is because if you hadn't put that on there, it could have just been a simple ID, but depending on what kind of ORM or what kind of database you use, that ID may be different. So the next thing is you can also define an options object. And as you see on here, I put the options object and I use simple nullables allowing to be true. By default, nullable will be false. But you can also have a description, deprecation reason, and a whole bunch of different objects. Just check the API for what the different options are for that object. Now, after you have that domain object, whenever you build it, it'll generate the schema based off of, you have to define where your objects are going to be stored. After you define that, you build, it finds all of your domain objects and generates your schema. And that's what you see over here on the right. So as you can see, the one-to-one comparison between the object I have on the left and the generation on the right. Now, you'll notice the one on the left doesn't have all the fields on the right. That's because my screenshot just cut them off. But you'll see the full version of it in code once we dive into it. But again, I didn't have to generate any of that information. In this application, another technology that I don't really highlight, but I'll mention real quickly is if I were to make a change on the left and the schema is auto-generated on the right, you can turn on auto migrations, which I have done in this project. Again, just trying to cut down as much of the overhead for our developers. There is definitely a conversation to be had with the power that that grants a developer to be able to change certain things, and you definitely have to know what you're going to be doing. But that feature is off by default. I turned it on just so that way it would all auto change and propagate to our database. I'm not going to dive in, like I said earlier, too heavy into the architecture of GraphQL or every feature, but I do have to highlight a few things because we are going to dive into them with how Nest utilizes them within this project. So that concept is a resolver. If you're used to having a RESTful API, you're probably used to having endpoints. But in a resolver, you're going to be having a collection of functions. And that's what our resolver annotation, or excuse me, our decorator is going to be used for inside this, this project. There are two different types. We have to know those two. There's going to be our queries, and our queries are simple, just getting information. The client is requesting a singular or collection of information, and then the server passes it back. And then for everything else, we have mutations, and that's our CUD. So we have our create, our update, and our delete. We're not going to be using this, but I also want to highlight this. Come out of the box, GraphQL has a playground. So if you were to run this application, you're going to go, well, how do I hit these endpoints? Normally, you would have to have some sort of third-party application, or you can hit those endpoints from command or however you want to do it. But I love GraphQL. They have this playground. I set mine localhost to 3000/GraphQL, whatever your localhost is with your port, followed by the GraphQL with this application. This screenshot is what you'll see. And this allows you to be able to have a graphical interface for you to run all of your queries and your mutations. In this project, we're going to be using Postman. I use it, been using it professionally and in my own side projects for many years. Absolutely love it. And as of this year, they actually incorporated GraphQL. It was the #1 feature for requested for the developers to add in there, and it was in beta earlier this year. And after creating this application, I found out that it's in full production. So we're going to be using that for both time's sake. I've already created some queries, but I wanted to let you guys know that this does exist here and easy to access. So. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in the code. You'll have to give me a second. I have to switch over between my slideshow and my code. So give me just a moment. All right. All right, so right out of the gate, you're going to notice the file structure. There's something I want to highlight, but first off, let's go ahead and mention, like I said earlier, highly based off of Angular. So if you're an Angular developer or if you're familiar with the Angular project, whenever you scaffold the project using the Nest CLI, it's going to look a lot like this, right? And it's going to feel and really bridge that gap for a lot of developers. Now, I put everything, and this we'll expand this here in a second. I put everything in the user folder. Now, if you're going to have a one-off project, it's not going to do a lot. It's going to do something small, very singular. This concept of having everything in a feature folder is what this is called. This will do you just fine. It'll seem like there's a lot of files within this folder, but for a small one-off, it should do you just fine. Now, if you're going to scale and you want an enterprise level and you want to actually like organize your file structure, there are two different concepts I would suggest. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this out. We're going to go over the majority of these files pretty quickly. because they're going to be pretty self-explanatory, and that's because of Nest, and they just make it so easy. But if you did want to scale, I would probably recommend one of two different strategies. If you wanted to organize your project a little bit better and not have it feature locked, meaning you have it like a user feature, you would have another one that maybe it was like an admin breaking down this project and then putting all these files scoped within the feature. You can break them out based off of the category in which they are. For example, you would have a folder called decorators, a folder for your strategies, a folder for your entities, your inputs, your models, and everything related to that, your utilities. So then all of your feature, all it really has is your module that has everything imported into it, your resolver, and then your service. So that way, everything is more contextually related to the category in which it is. And that'll allow you to expand within your project. An alternative approach that does have a lot more cognitive overhead in setting up, but it is the most reusable and scalable solution, is to pull out some of these into their own private repositories and then import those. So you would have them in a library, and then you can put those inside your package and then go ahead and download them into there. So for example, what I did was I wanted to use these strategies, which we'll go into here shortly. So that way I was able to use this Jwt strategies in a multitude of different projects. And I created my simple core library. I uploaded mine to a private NPM repository and then downloaded that into my project. Excuse me. That is definitely the best way, I feel like, for scaling. You could pull that into your core entities as well. Depending on what kind of service you're going to be running, there's a lot of overhead in doing that. And whether you make it public or private, it doesn't matter. That does require you to pull out this code. But I wanted to go ahead and mention that it is a possibility to scale that using this, because again, it is based off of the Node.js. And if you're familiar with how people scale their solutions with Node, they translate over here inside Nest as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. What we're going to do is we're going to start from the client most facing side, I guess I should say, and go all the way down to the database layer. And then after we have done that, we're going to go ahead and see a live example using Postman. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to go to our resolver. And we had kind of mentioned that before, but our resolver is where our client is going to hit, right? So it's our entry point. And the first thing you're going to notice, like I had mentioned, is that Nest uses decorators for pretty much everything. And I love that because that keeps all of the code very clean and concise. So the first thing you're going to have to do is define it as a resolver, and then also whatever object it is a resolver for. So I have my user entity. And then from there, you're going to be able to see the two different types that I had mentioned, right? So inside a resolver with GraphQL, you either have a query or you have a mutation. We're going to go over those real quick. So I have a basic test that I like to put in a lot of my code. I have an alive function. So the reason why I put that in there is just to make sure that the service is running. It's an easy way for me to be able to ping it. Now, it's a heartbeat of sorts, and you can definitely, I can see someone had brought up before, what if people try to DDoS me by hitting that alive test because it's not, protected by any auth guards. There's definitely things that you can do. I just have this one in here, and I've never found a problem with it. But it's the simplest example I can give for a query, right? So we define it as a query. We define it as its return type. So it's not a complex object. It's just a primitive Boolean. And then we have the type, which is return true, and that's it. So when we go to query this, we just query alive, and it should return back true if the service is working. If we want to go into a little bit more complex of a query, we could go here and get a user by ID. Now, you'll notice that it's a query. It's returning back not a primitive type, but an object, a user. And go ahead and ignore this, this guard that's on here right now. We'll get into that in a bit. But we have something a little bit different before, right? So as before with the alive, it was just by itself. But here, not only are we passing back an object, but we're also passing in a parameter. So we're passing in an ID. It'll then take that ID, call the service, get whatever information it wants, and then return back that object. So we're getting a little bit more advanced with that. If you were going to go and pass in a full object, you can do that as well. So we have another call on here called who am I? Again, we're going to go over all these calls all the way through the stack here shortly. But not only do we pass in nothing, a single parameter, but we can also pass in a complex object that we have. And you'll see on these other calls, whether they're mutation or query, we can pass in complex objects that we're going to call inputs. And your inputs will go over, but think of an input as a queryable object. It'll look and feel very similar in this example as our domain object, but they vary significantly with the type of data that could be passed in, formatting, so on and so forth. But the input is exactly that. You have your input object, and then you have your output entity. So those are our queries. Now, what about our mutations, right? You're going to need to be able to create and you update and delete or destroy your objects. Now, how are we going to do that? So we have our mutations. We're going to go ahead and just take a look at, let's go ahead and create a user. Go ahead and collapse these a little bit. So on our create user, it looks and feels the exact same way, right? So you have your mutation, defining that it is a mutation. You have your object in which it's returning. You have your input, right? So you have your user input right there. And depending on what you have inside there, you can add your validation, so on and so forth. But there's no auth guard. Anyone can call the create user as long as they have the right query and then the right input, and then it calls its service. And mutations are all defined as such. Now, as you'll see here, there's nothing more elaborate at all with these resolvers. This example is a perfect example for what you want your resolvers to look like. Very clean, using as many decorators as possible, so that way you have code reuse. After you have that, what's the next step, right? So let's take, for instance, you have your queries and you want to call in. Well, you're going to have your service, which was injected inside here, inside the constructor. Well, let's go ahead and dive into that service. So we have the get user by ID. We have our basic service when it comes to getting the user by ID. Now, there's a lot of stuff inside these services, but I'm not going to get into that you need to add, but I'm not going to get into in this talk. Just the real bare bones stuff. But inside your service, you have your own basic service logic. You're going to be testing or checking to make sure that you have the right fields, validation, so on and so forth. But for this example, we're going to just get a user by an ID. So inside this, I have my user, passed it in through there. I have my repository, and then I'm going to go ahead and find one. Now, one of the things that I'm used to is the repository pattern. It's a very powerful pattern. If you're from the .NET world, this will sound a little weird, but it doesn't come baked into NestJS. Again, it's based off of Node. So what I'm using is TypeORM. So our ORM that we're using to communicate with the MS SQL is called TypeORM. And one of the things inside there that I loved about it was they do have the repository pattern built into it. So I just simply have my repository. I pass in the object in which the repository is in charge of, and then I have full access to it. One of the things that I will mention is, if you are familiar with Link, I have found that I translate my Link knowledge to this TypeScript variant for this ORM one-to-one. Like I've almost never had any issue with it. Now, the syntax may vary a little bit differently, but the TypeORM documentation is phenomenal. So I feel like it was probably written by someone who came from that community, because it's just translated really, really well. So definitely check that out if you need more information about how to utilize these repositories. But for instance, in this case, I just want to find a singular individual. I have a simple where clause, and then once I have that information, I then pass it back up to the stack. So it's an async function. I'm awaiting that repository call, and then I pass it right back to the resolver. It's that simple, right? You can do more with it, but for this example, we're just going straight through. So we're going to go back to our resolver. All of our service calls are going to be pretty much like that. But there's one thing that I want to look at before we do. So in our mutation, let's say for example, we're going to create a user. We noticed that before we had our input, but I had mentioned earlier that inputs and our entities or our domain objects are different. So our services are expecting an entity. I like to create, and it's a pattern that I use at my company, a utility that translates between them. So as you'll see here, go ahead and go inside. I have a user utility, and I usually have a utility for each one of my models and entities. Excuse me, I keep bouncing around between different verbiage. Our input object and our domain object. So I have some simple translation. All this does is map from one to another, and there is definitely better ways to do this. If you're familiar with JavaScript, you can definitely map those a lot easier, especially if they are a one-to-one, and you can use reflection to type them. I created it in this way just for this example so that we can really fully understand what it's doing. But it's really just mapping your input to your entity and vice versa. They are static objects, so that way you can easily map on the go like this, keeping your code very clean. Now take into account if you do make changes to one versus the other, you're going to update your mapper, and there's ways to validate those. And again, you can make those a lot cleaner and write them in more pure JavaScript form, so that way even that utility class that I just showed can be reduced. So we've translated our input object inside this mutation into an entity, and now we're ready to create that user. So let's go ahead and step inside this call and see what it's doing. Pretty self-explanatory. As I said before, I'm using the repository pattern. I'm saving that object. Definitely do more than what I do here. You need to make sure that the object doesn't have any collisions. So if you want to make sure that your emails are unique or your usernames are unique or whatever that may be, definitely put that in here. But the boilerplate code is, and once you have done all of that, you're going to save your object. And that's it. Just like you had with your get user by ID, you saved it, and then you return back your user. And in some cases, you may not want to return back your user. You may just want to return back a success or not, or maybe even just an ID. In my example, I'm returning back the full user object. So now we've seen a query. We've seen a mutation. We've gone to the service for getting a simple object. We've also created an object using our repository patterns. But there was something at the very beginning when we wanted to get a user by an ID, and that was this, right? So we had a guard. Well, what's a guard? Well, if everyone's used backend server-side application before, specifically if you're familiar with REST, is you're going to have permissions. You can't just give your client access to every single endpoint, not to mention you don't want to have a fully open endpoint, because what if your other users that aren't using your application are trying to gain that information? So you have to lock that down in some way, and that's where guards really come into place. There are a multitude of different types of guards. I'm focusing here on what I feel to be the most prevalent one, and the one that you need to have almost right away, which is your auth guard, making sure that your user is authenticated to access certain endpoints. Now, these functions are protected by a decorator called useGuards. And then I wrote a Jwt Strategy Guard for this implementation. So what that means is this get user by ID, if the client was calling this function and they did not have an authenticated JWT, they would not be allowed access to this. The power behind using this decorator, the useGuard, is what it does is if you put this decorator on any of these functions, they won't even be able to have access to that function. It'll return back an unauthorized 401. That's really cool because it allows for not using any of the service's resources. So it does this simple check ahead of time before it even gains access to that. And if I ever want to lock down something or remove or restrict or remove restrictions from one, I just have to add or remove this decorator, and that's as simple as I have to add it. And I really love that feature, just tying that in, and they can do that with the different types of guards. So the first thing is well, how do I gain access to it, right? That's where this login function is. Now, don't beat me up over this. I did the very minimal version for authentication when it comes to validating passwords. I use the email and password. So you're going to see on here that I use a whole string comparison. It's the worst way to do it, but for this example, we're trying to focus on the guard and the JWT strategy, not how to save, hash, or do anything related to passwords. So the client calls your login. This mutation is expecting an email and a password. It then uses those to validate it. So let's go ahead and dive into that validation of user. As you see here, I'm doing some simple finding. I'm expecting there to be one. If it finds one, what I do is I go down and I have a simple check to see, is this user empty or not? Is the password that I'm looking for? And if it is, return back that user. Again, I even put a note in here. This is not the best way to do this. Definitely do your hashing. Don't store whole string passwords. Follow your standard strategies. If you do this in your code, I've given my 2 cents. It's not because of me. But you validate your user, everything looks good, you pass it back up to the resolver. And we have our user object. The next thing we have to check to make sure is our user a real or not? If they are, because it was just authenticated, then what do I do? A common pattern that I like to use is last login. So what I do here is just I create the date time for when it was authenticated, when they were trying to log in. And then I just simply call the user service update. Do a simple save real quick. And so that way inside the database, I have when was the last time they logged in. And then from there, I need to create my token, right? They've been authenticated. Now they want to call other guarded endpoints. Well, how do I do that? Well, this is how I do it. I created a create JWT token, and I realized that I did put the T inside JWT as token, but for this example, I just wanted to make sure that that's what you were doing. So go ahead and go inside that service. Well, how do I create my token, right? Like, am I gonna have to write that by hand? Absolutely not. Nest solves that problem for us. You do have to provide some information so it knows what to do, but it does the majority of the work. So the first thing is I have my payload. My payload is made up of the email and the ID. Your payload can be written in different ways. But after you have your payload, you need to sign your payload, and that's ultimately what creates your token. And what is this token? Well, that's what JWT is known for. And I had to write a strategy so that way NestJs knows how to create that signed token. And that's where we're going to go over here. And I have 2 different strategies that I have to show you. The first is I have my JWT strategy. Now, you can pick different strategies, but looking at this one, since I decided to go with JWT, you're going to have to look at from top to bottom. I extend the passport strategy, again, built into NestJs. I pass in that it is a strategy, and then I have a string representing what I am calling it. So I just simply called it JWT. And that will make more sense in the next strategy that we'll highlight here in a second. After we have imported, after we've imported it and we extend it right on there, it is expecting some information from there. So I am building that here. One thing you'll note on here is that I have the secret key, and I just have it as just secret key. This is for the example only, kind of like the storing the password and doing whole string comparison. Do not do this, because this is the secret key that's going to be used to create your token. So it's important, right? You want to keep that as private as possible. I put this in here. There are libraries for importing. If you wanted to have an environments file within your application, there's ways to import that so that way you can use it in here. The common strategy that a lot of people use is actually using a environment variable. What I'm saying is for this example, my secret key is just secret key with Pascal case, and you want to go ahead and not do that. You want to actually use some other way to obtain your secret. After you have your secret, all this stuff is fed inside the passport strategy, and now you're ready to go, right? Like you're ready to configure your Nest is now ready to give you your token. Well, what is it doing, right, behind the scenes? How am I getting my token? Well, that's where your GraphQL strategy comes into place. So you're going to have 2 parts to your token. I need a token, so issuing the token, and I need to validate my token, so I need to make sure that it's authenticated. So both the creation and then the use case for those, that's where these 2 strategies come into place. So your GraphQL strategy that I have built here, again, uses the same string annotation, so that way it knows where to find the corresponding passport strategy. So that way it says, hey, I have this token. I need to make sure that it is proper, right? So that's signed properly, that it's not expired, that someone didn't modify it or try to spoof it, make sure that it's someone else. And ultimately, gain access and say that, yes, this is a proper token. And so the first one is to sign it. The second one is to make sure that it is proper, right? So what does that look like now that we've seen both of these strategies? Well, we'll go back to our resolver and we'll see. So we have our login. We go inside. We have our create JWT token. We go inside. We now have our payload. We do our JWT service, which then signs our token. We have our token. We then assign it to the user object, and we return that user object back to the client call. And now they have access to it. They are then expected to handle any other authorization token as if you were to do it. So with an OAuth token, you're going to go ahead and put that inside the header. Make sure that you've put it in the right place, so that way the payload that was written here knows where to obtain that token and to then ultimately authorize it. So now we've passed it back to the client, and now the client is calling in. Again, we are going off of the same function. We have the get user by ID. What does that do, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, before it even hits that function, it needs to authenticate it because it has this decorator use authguard. So then it calls, okay, well, what authguard do I need to use? The GQL authguard, okay? Now it goes inside there, and then it asks, okay, well, what do I need to do? Well, I need to see if I can authenticate it. So it goes inside, it creates the context, gets your request, and then actually says, okay, super, here's my request, here's my context, here's my token. Do I have access to it? It takes all of the configurations that you have set up. It takes the payload's JWT, says yay or nay. If it is, it lets you through, and then over back at the resolver, it calls in the corresponding function and then does everything it needs to. If it does not have access, whether it is improper token, meaning that it was expired, wrong credentials, so on and so forth, it passes back a 401 unauthorized. And that's it, right? So before we jump into that, let's kind of break that down, right? What have we done here? We've created a simple way of logging in. We've created a simple way to create a JWT and a simple way to utilize that JWT. Now, these guards, you may be thinking, well, what if I want to have permissions, right? So the way that this implementation works, once a user authenticates, they're all treated the same way. But you're going to have different roles. You're going to have different permissions. You're going to have different types of users. Definitely, I agree with all that. All that can be easily incorporated inside here. You can elaborate on your guard. You can change that on inside your function, so that way it's within your service. However you want to end up doing that is up to you. That's going to be within your architect's decision. But utilizing the NestJS's framework is really simple, using these decorators and then creating a few strategies. And I hope that you can see that here. There's one last thing that I found that I really liked. I created this current user. What this is doing is this allows me to be able to not pass in anything or expect the user to pass in anything, but inside the request, I'm going to gain access to that token. And that makes it a lot easier for me to be able to pass in information. So I'm passing in that token, and I want to know, well, what's the information on that token, right? I don't want to have to expect all that information. So what does that look like? Well, I can actually gain the data, right? And I have it as an unknown type because I don't know what it is. And what I try to do, and that's the important part, I get the context, and then from the request, I try to get the user from that context. And we'll actually see a use case in that here shortly on what that can visually look like. But this is just one of those ways of minimizing even one step further our function calls and trying to utilize as much of those technologies, the JWT, the decorators, and utilizing that as much as possible to have cleaner, simpler, and reusable code. So now that we've kind of went over the core technologies with the slideshow, we have broken down all of this code, and I realize it's a lot to take in, but all of this entire project that I'm working on here, I updated last night, so it's on our GitHub repository. So if you want to dive further into this, I highly encourage it. We didn't go over all the different calls, just the high-end overview of them. Download the project, clone it, leave your comments on it. If you find an issue, create a ticket, and I'll be more than happy to talk with you about it. But let's go ahead and dive into Postman. So let me stop sharing and switch over to that. One thing I would like to mention is I am not promoting or getting paid to promote Postman. It's just a really cool utility. I love applications. I love free stuff. You know, I'm a bargain brother. I want as much free as I can get. In this application, you can use it for free for a long time. My organization switched over to using it because we can collab and add all our endpoints in there. We can have different environments. So it's just a real cool tool. And if you've never used it, I highly encourage it. It'll really help you. And if your team isn't utilizing it, if someone has a whole bunch of queries, give them to me. Like, I want them. And this is an easy way to share those, so that way I don't have to write it, right? That being said, for this application, I actually added a few of my endpoints on here. So these function calls from GraphQL. And I believe I started the service before starting here, but let's go ahead and check to see if the service is up and running. So the first thing is what's going on, right? This is a live call. I don't really know what's happening. Well, let's take a look at the body, right? So this is emulating a client. So I have my live test. It's a query. And all a query is a bracket and then the query syntax. And remember, a live didn't have anything. It didn't have any parameters. It didn't have to have any input. The return type I didn't need to query what I wanted my return type. So it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just alive. And so I'm going to hit send and see if it's alive. So down at the bottom, I have my response. I have my data, and then I have what my query is, what it's called, and its return value. So it's saying true. So that's it, right? Like, my service is up and running. I trust that my service is running because I wouldn't hit this otherwise. But what else do I need to do, right? So let's go through the same example in code, but in Postman. So the first thing we did was get a user by ID, right? So we're going to go to the body. We'll notice that there's a little bit more to work with. So we have the actual function, get user by ID. We have the parameter that's being passed in. And then we have the return type. And this is where I love GraphQL. Again, I'm not going to dive too much into it, just touch on a few of the features. But we have the return type, and I have to know what I want to query. So these are the fields that I'm expecting back. So I'm telling GraphQL that I want a user. And specifically, when I want that user, these are the fields of the user that I want. So let's go ahead and hit send and let's see what happens. OK, I'm getting an unauthorized 401. Which is good. That means that my guard is working properly, right? I'm not authenticated. I haven't logged in. So how can I get this user, right? Well, I'm going to have to authenticate. Well, before we do, let's go ahead and create a new user. So I'm going to leave this one open. We're going to go ahead and create a new user. We're going to go to body. And there's something inside here. So the two things that I want to highlight. First off is our simple brackets has now changed. We have a little bit more. We have a mutation, right? So you have to denote the difference between a query and a mutation. Well, the mutation is going to take your input, and that's going to be what is it expecting, right? And so I have a user input. I define that, and then the syntax will look familiar, right? So then I have my function, which is create user. I'm passing in my parameter, which is my user object just above. And then I have what field do I want to have returned. I'm just going to pass back the simple ID. I don't need the rest of the information, just the ID. But I could put the entire user input as I did on the get by ID if I wanted to. Over on the right, to make my life a little bit easier, I wrote a reusable GraphQL variable. This object is what you see over inside here. So anything in Postman you see over in the variables, it's denoted by the $sign variable name. It'll insert it from the right to the left. So let's go ahead and create one. So we're going to create a new user. It was successful because I got back my ID. So I have my ID of 6. Well, I can't go over to get by ID because I haven't authenticated yet. So what am I going to do? I need to log in, right? So inside that whole cycle between authentication, I need to have a signed token. So that way all my future requests will be authenticated. So we're going to go to login. There is a cycle within here that we have to kind of go over real quick. So we have our body to log in, and then we have to make sure that we have our token. Our body is a mutation, so we're passing in the 2 parameters, email and password. You may want to pass in a full object. I'm just passing in these 2 fields for example's sake, but you may want to put in a whole user input that has the token in there. Or has your credentials, permissions, whatever that may be. It's dependent on you. But for this, we have two. We have our email for password. Look over to the right on the variables. We have our same email and our same password that we just created over on our other call. And then we call the function, which is login, passing in said email and password. And what are we expecting back? We're expecting back the token. Another thing is within Postman, I don't want to have to copy that token. So whenever I issue it, so let's just go ahead and send it. I'm authenticated. It passed back this token, this really long JWT. And this is a lot to decompress. Again, look at the JWT documentation or Aaron's talk that he did at the Lightning Talk. He breaks down this, but it's a long piece of information. I'm not going to copy and paste that in every single one of my requests. I'm not going to go to the headers tab and paste it in there. So what I did is I went inside tests and I said if it was authenticated, meaning that there was data inside the JSON response, then I created a variable, environment variable called auth token, and I assign the data here to that auth token. So that way, in all my subsequential requests, I can just already have that baked in and not have to modify those requests. So that's what's going to be happening here. So I don't know what my alive time was. I don't know how long it was before my expiration date is on my token. So we're just going to log in again and generate a new token just to be on the safe side. So now I've logged in. I created a user, authenticated, and I was logged in. So again, that's from that strategy. I issued my token. I want to go over here to get by ID. I was unauthorized at first. We're going to change the ID real quick to 6 because I believe it was 6. And then I hit send. Boom. Now I have my user, right? Before I didn't have anything, and now I do. And it's because I'm authenticated. Well, how did it do that? Remember, the first part of the strategy was signing the token. And that was our JWT strategy. But then we need our GraphQL strategy. So that way it knows that it can authenticate. And it actually takes that token and makes sure that it's legit. Well, if you go over to the authentication tab, remember in my test, I actually wrote it to a global variable. So I have my token, which is auth token. It's OAuth2. And then this will automatically, when I hit send, it builds that for me. So that way it puts it inside the header and does everything it needs to. In the respect to the client, you would then have to make sure to do this as well, depending on whatever technology. There's frameworks out there to help you do that, or you can just manually tack that on there. However you end up doing it, this is the way that Postman ends up doing it. So what's that all look like, right? So we went in through it with code. Well, we created a user. We have an ID. We then logged in with the email, password. The system signed, returned back our token. Our client, or Postman in this respect, then uses that token and then gains authorization because it's alive and it was authenticated, or excuse me, it was non-expired and it was the proper user credentials. And that's it, right? A little icing on top of the cake, if you remember at the very end before we switched off the code, was I had a decorator called current user. Well, who am I is a perfect example. So it takes in the body, right? Notice how there's nothing there. I'm not passing any parameter, but it's still passing in that token. But I have no parameters, and I don't think I'm still logged in. We'll see. Yeah, I have a really short expiration date on this example. So I'm gonna go ahead and log in. Have a lot longer than a few seconds. I think mine's only a minute or two, unless I'm really long-winded. But I'm logged in now, new token. I hit who am I, and then it gives me that information, right? Based off of my context, my payload. There is a lot to decompress here. But what I'm trying to tell you is that this is all built in a Nest. I didn't do anything magical, right? I didn't import a lot of third-party frameworks. So there is a lot of room here to really build the microservice that your organization does. If you have a specific strategy and pattern, your architect may say, I really want our tokens to be X. I really want us to use like this, who am I really want to reduce that. I want to have you force, the contract to be a specific way. But it's really up to you and how you design your services. If you're already using the NestJs style, but you're using it in pure Node, and you want to reduce that complexity or context switching, I guess I should say, might be a perfect opportunity for you. One thing I didn't have a chance to really highlight in was the testing, but I've used a significant amount of TypeScript testing frameworks now in our Angular projects and our Vue projects, and it wasn't very different inside Nest, and you were able to really drive home the same sort of TDD strategies that you're probably already accustomed to. So that's really what I have going on with this service. I highly recommend downloading it, playing around with the code, and really pushing it to its limits to see if there's some stuff on there. I have not played around with a lot of guards. I wrote the bare minimum on here, and then my client has went in there and really, I don't know, added a whole bunch more and really made it their own. So I think that's the difference is that with a lot of more modern day Node frameworks, they are very versatile. If you are a domain-driven design company or shop, I can definitely see some arguments to be made on some pros to use as a .NET framework or even other frameworks. But I can tell you that depending on if you are a front-end heavy shop or TypeScript heavy shop, this is a tool that can reduce complexities and have you spin up microservices with minimal effort, and their documentation is great. So with that, I think I don't have anything more to share. So I'm going to open it up to any questions. So Gabe, do we have any for me inside chat?
So for starters, you got some shout outs.
Cool.
A couple people said great job on everything, and we did get one question from Kimberly Collins earlier about what was that pizza link that you were sharing.
Yeah, definitely. JinnStudios.com/pizza. It's a Google form. Fill it out. We do a drawing every month. It's the 20th, so in the next 10 or 11 days, we'll be doing a drawing. And if you put your information there, we will reach out to you via email. It'll be my business admin or someone in my organization will reach out to you and figure out the best way to get it to you given COVID. And we want to make sure that we stay safe, both with your organizations and my company. But yeah, JinnStudios.com/pizza.
Awesome. Beyond that, we'll wait a little bit longer. I've noticed with the Twitch stream, there's a little bit of a delay from what we on the Google Meet are seeing. So give everybody a good 15 full seconds or so to think of anything. Otherwise, there was a mention that Insomnia is a potential alternative to Postman. Everyone in the Twitch channel, Twitch chat really likes Postman, myself included. I use it all the time.
Yeah, I was actually about to. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say when you were done talking, I was gonna post, hey, has anybody used Postman and Insomnia? Because I use Insomnia and I'm kind of curious, like a side by side of them.
I've actually heard a lot about it. I mentioned Postman to a friend of mine that I collab with on side projects, and he uses it because of the cost. And I can see it. For a smaller team, Postman is cheap, free, and super easy. But like, I didn't realize how what the cost and the benefit is to an organization. So depending on what you're looking at, his shop is huge on Linux, huge on free, and Insomnia definitely was a pro in that respect. So it really just kind of depends. I don't pay anything for my own personal projects, so I don't think about that. But yeah, it's definitely a cost analysis is one of the things I've heard for a comparison.
Insomnia has a free tier too. Actually, I haven't paid for it either.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Is like their free tier is better than
Gotcha.
By far, from what I have heard. Because as you saw, I'm not sure if you saw mine, it said I expired based off of my requests and my shares, which I think I expire on like the second day of every month. They're like, hey, you're expired this month. And I'm like, yeah, I use this tool a lot. So.
Otherwise, we haven't gotten any other questions. A couple other things a couple of the links people have shouted out. On November 14th, which is just after Thunder Plains this year, we'll talk about that. There's a Django Fest workshop. You can go to techlahoma.org/Django-Fest to learn about that. And tonight at 7, there's a talk over how to become a more creative thinker under the UCG Pro Meetup group. You can Google that, or if you're in the Twitch channel, just look at the links shared there. Yeah, beyond that, I don't think we have any other questions. So yeah, everyone, again, virtual applause for Stephen. That was a rockin' talk. Great job.
Appreciate it. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it.
There was quite a few shout outs of people saying that it was a great talk.
Yeah.
So
Thanks,
you did awesome.
Definitely download the code. I've only done it with one client. I have a couple of my own projects that I've fell in love with it, and I created a base project that I now clone and keep up to date. But I want more feedback, so I encourage it because I have no loyalties to a framework, man. You give me something better to play with, I'm gonna nerd out and I'm gonna flock to that too. So definitely give me some homework.
So to wrap up, I want to share our Meetup link, and I'm going to try to present my screen, specifically a Chrome tab here. Let's see if I can grab the right tab. Okay, this should be it. So if a lot of you all are likely have seen this before, but if you are new or watching this on YouTube down the road, please join us on meetup.com/OKC WebDevs. That's the main hub where you will be able to see anything that we share. You can see this is today's meetup, previous meetups, you'll see upcoming meetups, etc. And lastly, I mentioned that Thunderplane is coming up. That's coming up on November 12th. I'm going to share a little page about that as well. I do know that this year there are, with COVID, it's a virtual conference, 100% virtual. The talks have not been 100% decided yet, but you can go ahead and register. There are free ticket options. There's also donation and sponsorship options. And if you want a shirt, there's an option for that as well. Just click this register now. But again, 2020.thunderplanesconf.com. To learn more about it, if you've never heard of Thunderplanes, it is Techlahoma's largest conference that goes on annually around November or October. It focuses on, I'd say, historically HTML, JavaScript, CSS, web development type things, but there's been data science talks. It's very eclectic. So I guess right here, Web Developer Conference. So hit that up. You can follow them, Thunderplanes or Techlahoma on Twitter. And that's all I'll say about that. Otherwise, we are OKC WebDevs. We meet on the third Tuesday of every month. Well, not every month. Historically, it's been every month. But with COVID, as I mentioned in the last talk, we are not going to guarantee that we meet every month. With next month, for example, our meetup would fall on the Tuesday after Thunderplanes. We don't have a current speaker for that Tuesday. So if you would like to speak, hit us up. We'll try to be as open as we can be about whether we are or aren't meeting. But again, just follow that meetup channel and you'll get all of the information that you need to. So that's yeah, that's all that I can say. Oh, we are so you'll notice on that meetup page we didn't have a logo. We are still working on that. We've mentioned that we would love that to be a community thing, and I'll be honest, like we've requested things from the community, but we haven't done a full-blown go to this page, learn more about it type experience. I think we're being more ad hoc with it, honestly. So if you would like to have a go at providing an OKC WebDevs logo, by all means, shoot that out to myself or Stephen Vincent. And Stephen, if you want to add anything onto that, yeah, by all means.
No, we're just excited about it. We want to get more community involvement. And Techlahoma is exactly that. It's people in our chat have been talking about different talks. So we are, if you have someone, an artist friend, if they're here in the state or they're not, just, let them know. And then just piggybacking off of the talks, if we have a lot of people that don't feel comfortable or don't really think that they can talk for 30 minutes or even an hour, and you want to do a lightning talk, we want to get a lot of those developers in. If you're not a good public speaker, now is the perfect time to do it. It's all digital. You don't have to worry about stage fright. Or if you just have like a really fun project you want to talk about, we can definitely get enough people together to talk about those kinds of things. So don't be shy. It's a good experience. It's all the guys are really cool. I got started in years ago on a topic when I was in college, and I had no idea what I was talking about. And here I am today. So I'm encouraging senior and junior developers. It does not matter about experience. It all matters about passion. So hit one of us up, please. And I would love to hear about your guys' projects that you're working on, or even if it's just a framework that you want to know more about. And this is just a platform to share. But I look forward to talking with more people about that. That's it.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, once again, a shout out to Stephen for being our speaker today. It was an awesome talk. Shout out to Gabe for being our streamer. Look at that handsome picture there in that Google Meetup. And that's it. We will see everybody at the next meetup. It may be November. It may not be. Just follow our meetup page and you will hear about it. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.